What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. In today's video, we have a few guests to the channel. Ian and Braden from cEDH Cast joined us for a stream on our Twitch channel recently, and then we recorded a game with them afterwards for this video. And honestly, it turned out to be one of the most interactive games I think we've really had on this channel to date, and I think you'll really enjoy it. If you do like podcasts and discussion style videos on cEDH topics, be sure to check out their channel. Link will be in the description. And before we get into the opening hands and deck introductions, we have a few quick channel promotions. The first being, if you want to rep some Casually Competitive merch, head on over to our website, casuallycompetitivemtg.com. If you want to help support the channel financially, we have a Patreon available. We really do appreciate the help and support these guys give, and if you want to be part of that, we have a reward system that we think you'll appreciate. If you're buying cards in the near future, be sure to click on our TCG affiliate link in the description. After clicking on that link, any purchase you make in the near future will help out the channel at no cost to you. And finally, if you want to join our community and get to know us a little better, we have a Discord link in the description. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the opening hands. Nate went first in this game, and he played his Urza Lord High Artificer deck. The goal of this deck is to somehow generate infinite mana through something like a Basalt Monolith and Power Artifact, or Isochron Scepter, just any way to generate infinite colorless mana, and then activate Urza an infinite amount of times to find the win conditions he needs. Nate's opening hand contained a Castle Vantress, a Seat of the Synod, an Island, an Ancient Tomb, a Torpor Orb, a Sapphire Medallion, and a Static Orb. Going second was one of our guests, Braden, playing his medium green deck. The goal of medium green is to be a mid-range consultation-based deck that looks to get a lot of value off of Thrasios using a card like Seedborn Muse, and eventually winning the game through a Demonic Consultation Laboratory Maniac type effect. Braden kept 6 cards in his opening hand, and those cards were a Bayou, a Gaia's Cradle, a Mana Crypt, a Birds of Paradise, a Dispel, a Force of Will, and he put an Underground Sea to the bottom. Going third was another one of our guests, Ian, playing the partner commanders Thrasios Triton Hero and Bruse Tarl Borsche Herder in a deck that is commonly known as Evolution. The goal of this deck is to, similar to medium green, get a lot of value off of Thrasios. However, with the color choices you have, a few more options for Thrasios value like Zerta the Dawnwaker, and having access to red allows him to run a combo line that includes Underworld Breach and Brain Freeze, allowing him to either mill himself and cast his entire library from his graveyard, and then win through either getting a very high storm count and brain freezing his opponents, or through a really large finale of devastation. Ian's opening hand contained a Verdant Catacombs, an Arid Mesa, a Stomping Grounds, a Mana Confluence, a Swords to Plowshares, an Avacyn's Pilgrim, and a Rhystic Study. And finally, going last is Bill playing Kykar Wind's Fury. This deck revolves around the card Divergent Transformations in order to turn 2 spirits into Elsha of the Infinite and Spellseeker, which allows him to tutor up Sensei's Divining Top, and then with Elsha, he can cast it from the top of his library, essentially drawing his entire library, since every time he casts top, he generates a spirit. He can then tap the top to draw a card and put Sensei's Divining Top back on top of his library, and he can then replay with Elsha, repeating this loop, drawing his library, and then winning with his deck in his hand. Bill's opening hand contained an Adarkar Wastes, a Shivan Reef, an Exotic Orchard, an Ancient Tomb, a Brainstorm, an Underworld Breach, and a Force of Negation. Now with the opening hands and deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. He starts this game by drawing, playing an Ancient Tomb, and then tapping it, paying 2 life to cast a Sapphire Medallion. He then gives the turn to Braden. Braden draws, plays a Bayou, and taps that Bayou to cast a Birds of Paradise. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Ian. Ian draws, plays a Verdant Catacombs, and then immediately pays 1 life to sacrifice it to search up a tropical island to the battlefield. He then taps it to cast an Avacyn's Pilgrim. With nothing left, he ships the turn over to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Shivan Reef, and then taps it for a blue, paying 1 life to cast a Brainstorm. He draws 3 cards, puts 2 cards back on top, and then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays an island, and then wanting to hold up mana, gives the turn to Braden. Braden untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, and he then draws his card for turn. In his first main phase, he taps for 2 mana to cast Thrasios. He then, as his land, plays a Gaia's Cradle, and with nothing left, gives the turn to Ian. Ian untaps, draws, plays a Flooded Strand, and again immediately pays 1 life to sacrifice it to surge up a Tundra to the battlefield. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Rhystic Study. With nothing left, Ian gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps his mana, paying 2 life into the Ancient Tomb and paying additional mana for Rhystic Study to cast a Felwar Stone. He then goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Bill's end step, Nate taps his mana to cast Blink of an Eye, targeting Rhystic Study, paying 2 life into Ancient Tomb and paying an additional mana due to Rhystic Study. The Rhystic Study is bounced, and Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a Castle Vantress as his land, and then taps his mana to cast Urza, Lord High Artificer. He then for 0 mana casts a Lotus Petal, and he then taps his mana to cast a Static Orb. Not wanting his game plan to be disrupted too much, Braden exiles a Dispel and pays 1 life in order to cast a Force of Will without paying its mana cost, countering the Static Orb. Nate then goes to give the turn to Braden, and on Nate's end step, Braden pays 4 mana in order to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom and then getting a Gemstone Caverns to the battlefield tapped. Braden then goes to his turn, untaps, loses his Mana Crypt trigger, draws his card for turn, and then plays a Wooded Foothills. He then taps for 1 green mana to cast a Wild Growth, enchanting his Gemstone Caverns, and he then pays 1 life to crack his Wooded Foothills to search up a tropical island to the battlefield. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Spellseeker. When the Spellseeker enters the battlefield, he searches up a Tainted Pact to his hand. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Ian. Ian untaps, draws, plays an Arid Mesa, and again pays 1 life to crack it to search up a Volcanic Island. He then for 0 mana casts a Mana Crypt. He then taps his mana to recast his Rhystic Study, and when it resolves, he then taps his mana to cast his own Thrasios. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays an Exotic Orchard as his land, and then taps his mana to cast his commander, Kykar Wind's Fury, not paying for Rhystic and taking 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb. He then, with his floating mana, casts a Sensei's Divining Top, again not paying for Rhystic, and when it's cast, he generates a Spirit token from Kykar's ability. With nothing left, Bill gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a Seed of the Synod as his land, and he then casts a Torpor Orb, paying for Rhystic Study and taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb. He then goes to combat and swings his Construct at Braden, which is a 5/5. Braden declares no blocks, takes the damage, and Nate then goes to pass the turn to Braden, and on Nate's end step, Braden pays mana to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, and then revealing and drawing a Boreal Druid. Braden then goes to his turn, untaps, loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, draws his card, and then taps for 1 green mana to cast an Elvish Mystic, paying for the Rhystic Study. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Ian. Ian untaps and in his upkeep also loses his Mana Crypt trigger, and he then draws his card for turn. As his land, he shocks in a Stomping Ground, paying 2 life, and then for 0 mana, he casts a Chrome Mox. When it enters the battlefield, he imprints Noxious Revival, and he then taps his mana to cast his other partner commander, Bruse Tarl, Boorish Herder. The Torpor Orb stops the ETB effect of Bruse Tarl, and Ian then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep sacrifices a Spirit to Kykar's ability to generate a red mana in order to activate his top, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. He then draws, plays a Forbidden Orchard, and then taps his mana to cast a Merchant Scroll, paying for Rhystic Study, taking 2 from Ancient Tomb, and then getting a Spirit from Kykar on cast. When Merchant Scroll resolves, he searches up a Fierce Guardianship to his hand, and he then goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Bill's end step, Nate pays mana into Castle Vantress in order to scry 2 cards, and he decides to bottom them both. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays an island as his land, and then immediately goes to combat, swinging his 5/5 construct at Braden. In response to going to blockers, Braden activates his Gaia's Cradle in order to generate 4 green mana to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the top, and then putting a Mana Confluence into play tapped, and then blocks with the Spellseeker. Nate then goes to give the turn to Braden, and on Nate's end step, Braden pays 4 mana into Thrasios to activate it, scrying a card to the top, and then putting a Polluted Delta into play tapped. Braden then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger this time, and he then draws his card for turn. In his first main phase, he taps his mana to cast a Boreal Druid, paying for Rhystic Study, and then taps some more of his mana to cast his other partner commander, Tymna the Weaver, also paying for Ian's Rhystic Study. Braden then goes to pass the turn to Ian, and on Braden's end step, Ian pays his mana into Thrasios to activate it to scry a card to the bottom, and then reveal and draw a Birds of Paradise. Ian then goes to his turn, untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, draws a card for turn, and then plays a Mana Confluence as his land. He then activates Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, and then revealing a Polluted Delta and putting it into the battlefield tapped. He then taps his mana to cast a Birds of Paradise, and he then goes to combat, swings Bruse Tarl at Brayden, and on attacks he gives Bruse Tarl the trigger, giving it double strike and lifelink, and Brayden decides to block with his Boreal Druid. Ian gains 3 life from the damage that went through on the Boreal Druid, and Ian then goes to pass the turn to Bill. And on Ian's end step, Bill pays 1 mana into his Sensei's Divining Top in order to activate it to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library. Bill then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays a Polluted Delta as his land, and then pays 1 life to sacrifice it to search up an island to the battlefield. He then pays 1 mana into his Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library again, and he then taps his Divining Top to draw a card. He then taps his mana to cast a Frantic Search, taking 2 damage from Tomb and paying for the Rhystic Study, and on cast getting another Spirit from Kykar, in order to draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, which were a Darkar Wastes and a Steam Vents, and then untap 3 lands. He then recasts his Divining Top, paying an extra for Rhystic Study, and on cast getting another Spirit, and he then casts an Arcane Signet, again paying for Rhystic and getting another Spirit. He then goes to combat and swings Kykar at Ian. Ian declares no blockers, takes the damage. Bill goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Bill's end step, Nate pays his mana into Castle Vantress in order to scry 2 cards, and he decides to scry both to the top. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and really with no plays to make on his turn, decides to just pass the turn to Brayden. And on Nate's end step, Brayden activates Thrasios in order to scry a card to the top and put a Savannah into the battlefield tapped, and he then cracks his Polluted Delta, paying 1 life, to search up a snow-covered island to the battlefield, and then pays 4 more mana into Thrasios to scry a card to the bottom, and then reveal and draw a Flusterstorm. Brayden then goes to his turn, untaps, and in response to his Mana Crypt trigger, he taps his mana to cast an Enlightened Tutor, paying for Ian's Rhystic. It resolves, he searches a Soul Ring to the top of his library, and he then loses his Mana Crypt trigger, and draws the Soul Ring for turn. He then for 2 mana casts his Soul Ring, paying for Rhystic Study, and then goes to pass the turn to Ian, and on Brayden's end step, Ian activates his Thrasios, paying 1 life due to his lands, to scry a card to the top, and then revealing and drawing a Fierce Guardianship. Ian then goes to his turn, untaps, wins his Crypt trigger, draws his card for turn, and then cracks his Polluted Delta, paying 1 life in order to search up a Breeding Pool, paying 2 additional life to have it enter untapped. He then taps his mana to cast a Seedborn Muse. Now, you can't really tell from the narration, but everyone at the table was very concerned about the Seedborn with all of the mana Ian had available, so Nate decides to take action. He takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb in order to help hard cast a Force of Will, paying for Rhystic Study. In response to the Force of Will, Ian, for 0 mana, casts a Fierce Guardianship due to having his commanders on the battlefield. In response to Ian's Fierce Guardianship, Bill casts his own Fierce Guardianship, sacrificing a Spirit to Kykar to pay for Rhystic Study. In response to Bill's Fierce Guardianship, Ian exiles a Brain Freeze and pays 1 life to cast his own Force of Will, targeting Bill's Fierce Guardianship. In response to the Force of Will, Nate taps his mana to cast a Whir of Invention, X equaling 3. He does not pay for Rhystic Study, and then priorities get around on the Rhystic Study trigger, and in response to the Rhystic Study trigger before Ian can draw, Bill hard casts a Force of Negation, both not wanting Nate to get another artifact to the battlefield, one that will probably get him very close to winning, but also to up the Storm counter for the Flusterstorm in Brayden's hand that he had to reveal off of Thrasios. In response to the Force of Negation, Brayden then casts his Flusterstorm for 2 mana, paying for Rhystic Study, putting 7 of the copies on Ian's Force of Will, and putting the final copy on Ian's Fierce Guardianship. The Flusterstorm then resolves, Ian pays for the 1 mana on the Fierce Guardianship, the Force of Will is countered, the Whir of Invention is then countered, Ian then draws his card off of the Rhystic Study trigger from the Whir of Invention, and then currently on the stack is Bill's Fierce Guardianship targeting Ian's Fierce Guardianship. Now, in response to Bill's Fierce Guardianship, for 0 mana, Ian casts a Deflecting Swat targeting Bill's Fierce Guardianship, changing the target of Bill's counterspell to the Deflecting Swat. In response to the deflecting SWAT cast, Bill pays 1 mana to look and rearrange the top 3 cards of his library, and he then passes priority. Braden, when he gets priority, pays 4 mana to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, then getting a Tundra to the battlefield, and he then taps his mana to cast a Tainted Pact, paying an additional mana for Rhystic. He starts exiling cards and decides to stop when he finds an Assassin's Trophy. Now, of note, he does exile both his own Seedborn Muse and a Jace Wielder of Mysteries from the Tainted Pact. The deflecting SWAT then resolves. Bill's Fierce Guardianship then does not have a valid target. Ian's Fierce Guardianship resolves, countering the hard-casted Force of Will, and the Seedborn Muse then resolves. Ian then decides to go to his end step, and in response to moving to end step, Braden casts his Assassin's Trophy, targeting the Seedborn Muse, paying an additional mana for Rhystic Study. In response, Ian activates Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, and then revealing a Savannah, putting it onto the battlefield tapped. The Assassin's Trophy then resolves, destroying Seedborn Muse. Ian searches up a land to the battlefield, and then he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Mana Crypt for 1 mana, paying for Rhystic Study, getting a Spirit on cast, and then with nothing left to do, gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb to help generate enough mana to activate Urza. He shuffles his library and then exiles the top card of his library, which is an Evacuation. He decides to not cast it at this time, and then goes to combat, swinging his 5/5 Construct at Ian. Ian declares no blocks, takes the damage, and Nate then decides he doesn't want to cast Evacuation, and he just gives the turn to Braden. Braden untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3, and he then draws his card for turn. He then taps his mana to cast his own Rhystic Study, paying for Ian's Rhystic Study, and in response to this Rhystic Study, Ian casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Thrasios. In response to the Swords cast, Braden taps his Gaia's Cradle to generate mana while Thrasios is still on the battlefield, and then Thrasios is exiled. Braden gains 1 life, and Braden then pays 5 mana to recast Thrasios, the additional due to Rhystic Study. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Ian. Ian untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, and he then draws his card for turn. He plays a City of Brass, and he then taps his mana to cast an Eladamri's Call, paying for Rhystic Study, and in response to the Eladamri's Call, Bill taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card, and he then for 3 mana casts a Dispel, paying for both Rhystic Studies. In response to the Dispel, Ian pays 4 mana to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, and then revealing and drawing a Mental Misstep. He then pays 2 life and 1 mana to cast this Mental Misstep, paying for Rhystic Study, in order to counter the Dispel. In response to the Mental Misstep, Braden pays 4 mana to activate his Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, and then revealing an Underground Sea and putting it onto the battlefield tapped. The Eladamri's Call then resolves. Ian searches up a Zirda to his hands, and he then decides to tap his mana to cast this Zirda, paying for Rhystic Study. In response to Zirda, Braden decides to pay 4 mana to activate Thrasios, scrying a card to the top, and then revealing and drawing a Demonic Consultation. Priorities then get around on Zirda, and Nate decides to pay 4 mana to cast a Mana Drain, countering the Zirda. With nothing left, Ian gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage, and he then draws a card for turn. He then casts his Sensei's Divining Top, paying for both Rhystic Studies, taking 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb, getting a Spirit on cast, and then with his floating mana, when the top resolves, decides to activate top, rearranging the top 3 cards. He then for 4 mana casts an Underworld Breach, paying for both Rhystic Studies, and he then taps his mana to cast a Merchant Scroll from his graveyard, escaping it out by exiling 3 other cards. He only pays for Ian's Rhystic Study, allowing Braden to draw, and also on cast, he gets a Spirit from Kykar's ability. Merchant Scroll resolves, he gets a Brain Freeze to his hand, and he then taps his mana to cast his Brain Freeze, paying for Braden's Study, allowing Ian to draw and giving Nate another 1/1 Spirit from tapping the Forbidden Orchard. He targets himself with all the copies. The storm count is 4, so he mills 12 cards, and not milling anything that he needed, which would have been a card like a Lion's Eye Diamond, a Lotus Petal, or a Burning Inquiry. He decides to sack a Spirit in order to activate his Sensei's Divining Top to look and rearrange the top 3 cards of his library, and with nothing else, gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and in his first main phase gets 3 colorless mana from the Mana Drain. He then decides to use some of this mana to help cast a Tribute Mage, paying for both Rhystic Studies, and I regret to inform you that after about an hour and 45 minutes of this game, the players did forget that Torpor Orb was on the battlefield, even though it was just tapped for mana with Urza's ability. However, you will see very shortly why this isn't a big issue and doesn't really impact the game too much. Anyway, that all being said, he grabs a Winter Orb off of the illegal tutor. He then taps his mana to cast his Winter Orb, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb and paying for Brayden's Rhystic Study, allowing Ian to draw. He then goes to combat and swings his 6/6 Construct token at Brayden. Brayden declares no blocks, takes the damage, and Nate then goes to pass the turn to Brayden, and on Nate's end step, Brayden taps for 1 mana, taking 1 damage, to cast a Mystical Tutor, allowing Ian to draw, and off of the Mystical Tutor, he gets a Chain of Vapor. Brayden then goes to his turn and untaps his creatures and artifacts, and due to the Winter Orb can only untap 1 land, and he chooses a Gaia's Cradle. He then loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, taking 3 damage, and he then goes to combat and swings Thrasios and his Elvish Mystic at Bill. Bill blocks the Thrasios with Kykar. The Dork does damage to Bill. Bill takes 1, and in Brayden's second main phase, he pays 1 life to draw 1 card off of the Tymna trigger. He then plays a Misty Rainforest as his land for turn, and then cracks it, paying 1 life to shock in a Watery Grave, losing 2 more life. He then casts his Chain of Vapor for 2 mana, paying for the Rhystic Study, targeting the Torpor Orb on Nate's battlefield. In response to the Chain of Vapor, Nate activates Urza by paying 5 mana to shuffle his library, and he then exiles a Storage Matrix off the top of his library. In response to the Chain of Vapor still, Bill taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card, and then with no other further responses, the Torpor Orb is bounced. Brayden then taps his mana to cast a Finale of Devastation, X equaling 2, paying for Ian's Rhystic Study, in order to get a Thassa's Oracle to the battlefield. When it enters the battlefield, Brayden responds to the ETB effect to cast his Demonic Consultation, using his last mana to pay for Rhystic Study. There are no responses to Demonic Consultation, and Brayden names a card that's not in his library, exiles his library, and then the Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Brayden wins the game. Now, I know there is a negative connotation that's associated with Demonic Consultation wins, but if you really pick apart this game, there is so much more that went on and went into this win that it may not be super obvious. First, I want to say that overall, this was a very interactive game and a very exciting game. I wasn't actually here when it was recorded. I was busy editing a video when they played this game, and watching it back to take notes and record the audio for, it was very exciting. I found myself really not knowing what was going to happen and having a genuinely good time rewatching this game. It was one of the more interactive games that we've had on this channel, so it was a very exciting game through and through, but I want to talk about the ending, and I want to talk about Brayden's last turn, because his sequencing was very, very good for how he played that turn. Now, you may not really have realized this, but Brayden only had just enough mana to do what he needed to do if he drew a card off of Tymna. He did not have the land in hand, so he was risking a lot by sacrificing Thrasios in order to draw a card and just hope it's a land that can get him the color that he needed. He had some dorks and he had some green mana with the Gaia's Cradle and with some other things, but he needed the black mana for Demonic Consultation, and he also needed the Chain of Vapor mana. So having to get in a very specific land in order to win, I thought was very interesting and made for a really good ending. I know some people don't really like the Demonic Consultation ends, but I honestly have to say that this is a relatively exciting one just due to the perfect sequencing that had to happen and the fact that Brayden did need a very specific card in order to do what he needed to, and he was putting a lot on the line. Since he wasn't able to untap his lands, if Thrasios had died and he didn't draw a land, he would have been fairly behind if he had tried to recast Thrasios and not been able to activate it. He just probably wouldn't have had as much value as either Ian or Nate would have been getting. Now, Bill was kind of in the same situation, but he also tried to win on his turn and was stopped by either getting unlucky or just not getting lucky, I guess. Overall, though, that last turn cycle was just a very exciting one, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. There was a lot to dissect in this game, and I don't want to pick apart in the entire game and go by play, but if there is some part that you found interesting, let us know in the comments below what you thought of this game. That being said, that is all we have for this episode. We want to thank cEDH Cast for coming out, being on the stream, and then recording an additional game with us. It was a lot of fun, and you should definitely check them out if you haven't already. They have some really good podcasts and other various discussion-type videos that we personally find interesting, and we think you'll find interesting as well, so check them out if you haven't already. That being said, that is all we have for this video. I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.